Imagine driving home after a long day, ready to relax with your family, when flashing lights appear in your rearview mirror. You're not speeding, you've done nothing wrong. But within minutes, you're face to face with a police officer whose eyes are filled with judgment. Now imagine, as the tension rises, you reveal a truth that shifts everything. What happens next will shock an entire community and change a system that has allowed injustice to thrive for far too long. Before we dive into this intriguing story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe. It was a Friday evening in Tallahassee, Florida. The sun was setting behind the trees that lined the suburban streets, casting long shadows over the rows of houses. Darren Washington was driving home. Finally. His hands gripped the steering wheel of his silver SUV as he navigated the familiar roads, his mind already starting to unwind. For Darren, a black man in his late 30s and an FBI agent for the past decade, the week had been brutal. He'd been working on a federal case that drained him mentally, and all he could think about now was getting home to his wife, Maya, and their 2 young daughters. The thought of having dinner as a family and catching up with them was what kept him focused throughout the day. Dressed casually in a navy blue t-shirt and jeans, Darren didn't look like the authoritative figure he was on duty. That was the point. He liked blending in when he was off work, just another resident in the neighborhood, not the man in charge of cracking down on complex crimes. Today, though, he felt different. His instincts were sharper than usual. There was a strange tension in the air, though he couldn't put his finger on what it was. As he turned onto the final stretch of road, his thoughts were interrupted by flashing red and blue lights in his rearview mirror. A police cruiser, creeping up from behind him for the past minute, had its sirens on now. Darren frowned. He wasn't speeding. He hadn't run a stop sign. There was no reason for this. "What's this about?" he muttered under his breath, pulling over to the side of the road. He wasn't worried. He'd been through this before, and with his experience, he knew how to handle traffic stops. But something felt off. The cruiser pulled in behind him, its headlights glaring into his rearview mirror. Darren watched as a white officer stepped out of the car. Officer Grant. Darren knew his face. He was notorious around these parts for being tough on certain groups of people. Rumors floated around the community about his rough handling of black men, but Darren had never had a direct encounter with him. Until now. Officer Grant, in his mid-40s, walked over with an air of authority, his hand resting on his belt near his holstered gun. He didn't approach like a man who was just here for a routine check. His strides were stiff, his face hard, and his eyes, Darren noted, were already filled with judgment. "License and registration," Grant demanded, not bothering to explain why he had pulled Darren over. Darren took a deep breath, reaching calmly into the glove compartment for his registration. "Officer, can I ask why you pulled me over?" he asked, his voice measured and calm, though he could feel a knot forming in his stomach. Something about this didn't feel right. Grant didn't respond right away. His eyes scanned Darren's vehicle, as if looking for something incriminating. "Just give me your license and registration. Step out of the vehicle once you do," Grant said, the command sharp and immediate. Darren's grip tightened slightly on his documents. He handed them over, still keeping his voice even. "You didn't answer my question, officer." Grant leaned in closer, his breath sour. "I don't need to answer your questions. Step out of the car, now." It was clear this wasn't going to be an ordinary traffic stop. Darren knew when a situation was about to escalate. He'd been in far more dangerous situations than this on the job, but here, off-duty, he was at a disadvantage. He had to handle this carefully. "I'm cooperating, but I don't see any reason for me to step out of my vehicle," Darren said, remaining calm. Grant's face tightened. "Out of the car! Now!" Darren felt the tension escalate with every second. His heart rate quickened, but he wouldn't let it show. With a measured exhale, Darren opened the door and stepped out, his movements slow and deliberate. He stood tall in front of the officer, who was now only inches away from him. Darren could see the contempt in Grant's eyes. "Hands on the hood," Grant ordered, as if Darren were a criminal. Darren hadn't done anything to warrant this treatment. Still, he complied, not out of fear, but to keep the situation from spiraling. He placed his hands on the hood of his car, his jaw tight, silently processing the absurdity of it all. "What's this really about, officer?" Darren asked, his voice steady. "You think I don't know your type?" Grant spat, walking a circle around Darren, as though trying to size him up. "Fancy car, nice neighborhood, but you're not fooling anyone." Darren's stomach churned. There it was, the quiet racism seeping out of Grant's words. He wasn't being subtle, but Darren had seen it all before. This was the kind of prejudice he had fought against his entire life. As a child, as a student, and even now, as an FBI agent, he had experienced this type of profiling. But this time, he wasn't going to let it slide. Grant's eyes scanned Darren's pockets, his stance getting more aggressive. "What do you have on you? Anything I should know about? A weapon, maybe?" Darren narrowed his eyes but remained composed. "I'm not armed, officer. And I'm not a threat." Grant's smirk only widened. "We'll see about that." The officer patted Darren down with unnecessary force, as though hoping to find something incriminating. Darren stood still, resisting the urge to react. It was a deliberate attempt to provoke him, but Darren wasn't going to give Grant the satisfaction. Instead, Darren remained calm, his mind working on the next steps, thinking of how to get out of this situation safely. Then, without warning, Grant reached for his handcuffs. "Turn around," he ordered. Darren felt the situation spinning out of control. He knew he had to take control now before things escalated further. Slowly, he turned to face Grant. "Officer, I need to show you something," Darren said, his tone sharp but still calm. Grant froze, his eyes narrowing. "What do you mean?" Darren didn't move, his voice firm. "I'm an off-duty FBI agent." He reached for his wallet and carefully pulled out his badge, holding it up so Grant could see it clearly. "I'm not some criminal you can harass." The color drained from Grant's face. His confidence faltered, and for a split second, he looked as if he'd seen a ghost. Darren locked eyes with him, the tension now hanging thick in the air. Grant stammered, his bravado gone. I didn't know. You didn't ask." Darren cut him off, his voice low but powerful. "You just assumed." For the first time since the stop began, Darren saw something else in Grant's eyes. Fear. The kind of fear that came with knowing he'd just crossed a line he couldn't uncross. Suddenly, the police radio in Grant's car crackled to life. It was the local police chief's voice, authoritative and direct. "Officer Grant, report immediately to the station." Darren's eyes flicked to the cruiser. The timing was uncanny, but not unexpected. As an FBI agent, Darren's car had been outfitted with a security tracker, standard procedure for agents in his division. The chief had likely been alerted the moment Darren's car was pulled over, and now they were stepping in before things got worse. Darren walked over to Grant's cruiser and picked up the radio. He spoke directly to the chief, his voice calm but commanding. "Chief, it's Darren Washington. I'll be filing an official complaint against Officer Grant. He racially profiled me and escalated the situation without cause." Grant stood frozen, his hand still near his holster. He didn't dare speak. The chief's voice on the radio was tense. "Understood, Darren. Officer Grant will be disciplined." Darren handed the radio back to Grant, who was now visibly shaken. He didn't wait for an apology. He knew it wouldn't mean anything. Without another word, Darren got back into his car and drove away, leaving the officer standing there, shocked and defeated. But Darren knew this wasn't over. In the days that followed, Darren filed a formal complaint with the FBI and the local police department. Evidence from his car's dash cam, along with audio recordings of Grant's remarks, were enough to launch a full internal investigation. The media caught wind of the story, and soon, it was making headlines across the state. Officer Grant's history of complaints finally caught up with him. He was suspended from the force and faced an inquiry from both the FBI and the police department. His racial bias and misconduct couldn't be ignored any longer. A week later, it was announced that Officer Grant had been fired from the police force. The news shook the community. People who had been silent about similar experiences with Grant finally spoke up. It became a turning point for the department, with the police chief pledging to address racial bias and implement stricter accountability measures for officers. Darren's calm, measured response to a situation that could have easily escalated into something far worse became a powerful example of how to handle injustice. His actions led to real consequences, proving that no one, regardless of their position, is above the law. The firing of Officer Grant wasn't just about one man's mistake. It was a message to everyone watching that prejudice and racism would no longer be tolerated. Darren's courage and professionalism stood as a reminder of the importance of respect, accountability, and justice in a world that still had much to learn. Darren's weekend went by with a quiet hum of normalcy. Maya could sense that something had happened, but she knew Darren. He wouldn't talk about work until he was ready, so she gave him space. They spent time with their daughters, playing board games in the living room and taking a walk around their peaceful neighborhood. But even in the comfort of his home, Darren couldn't shake the weight of what had happened on Friday night. He replayed the interaction with Officer Grant over and over in his head, dissecting every moment. On Monday morning, Darren sat in his home office, cup of coffee in hand, staring at the computer screen. He knew he needed to finalize his official report about the stop. His FBI colleagues were supportive, and the internal affairs team had already requested all the evidence he had: dashcam footage, audio recordings, his personal statement. But it wasn't just about paperwork. For Darren, this was personal. He wasn't just filing a report about a police stop. He was standing up against something far more insidious: the systemic racism that had affected him and countless others for so long. As he began typing, his phone rang. It was his FBI supervisor, Agent Michael Stevens. Darren respected Michael, a white man in his 50s who had always advocated for fairness and integrity in their division. "Darren," Michael's voice came through the phone, calm but firm. "I just got off the phone with the police chief. They're launching their own internal investigation into Grant." Darren sighed, feeling a mix of relief and frustration. "That's good," he said, leaning back in his chair. "But you know as well as I do, these things don't always go anywhere, especially when it comes to a cop like Grant. He's been doing this for years, and nothing's changed." "I hear you," Michael replied, his tone softening. "But this time, we're backing you up. You're not alone in this. We're making sure this doesn't get swept under the rug." Darren appreciated the sentiment, but he'd been around long enough to know that change didn't come easily, not in a system built on years of silence and complicity. He thanked Michael and ended the call, returning his focus to the report in front of him. As his fingers hovered over the keyboard, he thought about how many others had been in his position. How many other black men had been harassed, humiliated, and silenced because they didn't have the means or the power to fight back. He couldn't let this go unanswered. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about all of them. Word about Darren's encounter with Officer Grant spread quickly through the community. It didn't take long for people to start talking. Darren wasn't the only one who had been pulled over by Grant. Dozens of others, black men, teenagers, even women, had their own stories to tell. Stories that had been quietly shared among friends, whispered about at family gatherings, but never taken seriously by the authorities. The local coffee shop on Bannerman Road became the unofficial meeting point for people to vent their frustrations. Every day, more voices joined the conversation. One by one, stories of mistreatment and intimidation at the hands of Officer Grant started to pour out. People who had been too scared or too tired to speak up before now felt emboldened. Darren's fight had given them the courage to say, "Enough." One evening, Darren was at the grocery store when he ran into an old neighbor, Mrs. Evelyn Matthews, a 70-year-old black woman who had lived in the neighborhood for decades. She greeted Darren with a warm smile, but there was something in her eyes, a quiet sorrow that Darren hadn't seen before. "I heard about what happened," she said softly, pushing her cart down the aisle. "I'm so sorry you had to go through that, Darren." Darren nodded, appreciating her concern. Thank you, Mrs. Matthews. But it's not just me. Grant's been doing this for years. She stopped and looked at him, her expression hardening. I know. He pulled over my grandson 2 months ago, treated him like a criminal, like he didn't belong here. He's only 16. Just a kid. Darren felt a surge of anger. He knew that Grant's behavior wasn't an isolated incident, but hearing it from someone like Mrs. Matthews made it all the more personal. I'm sorry, Darren said, his voice heavy with emotion. This has to stop. Mrs. Matthews nodded. It does. And we're behind you, Darren. The whole community is. As the investigation into Officer Grant's behavior progressed, the media caught wind of the story. Local news stations began covering the case, framing it as a turning point for the town. Tallahassee wasn't known for making national headlines, but the racial tension brewing in the community had become impossible to ignore. Darren found himself thrust into the spotlight, something he hadn't expected. He wasn't seeking fame or recognition. He just wanted justice. But now, he was the face of a growing movement. Every day, more people reached out to him, sharing their own experiences, offering support, or simply thanking him for taking a stand. It wasn't long before reporters began showing up at his doorstep, asking for interviews. Darren was careful about what he said publicly. He didn't want to make this about him. He wanted the focus to stay on the issue of racial profiling and police misconduct. So, when he did agree to speak with the press, he made sure to keep the conversation centered on the bigger picture. This isn't just about one traffic stop, Darren said during an interview with a local news anchor. It's about a pattern of behavior that's been allowed to go on for too long. We need to hold law enforcement accountable, and we need to address the systemic racism that allows officers like Grant to feel emboldened to act this way. The interview aired later that evening, and Darren's words resonated with people across the city. His message was clear, and it struck a chord with those who had felt powerless for so long. But not everyone was happy about the attention Darren was bringing to the situation. As Darren's story gained traction, there were those within the police department and the community who felt threatened by the growing scrutiny. Officer Grant had allies, other officers who shared his views, and even some influential figures in the city who didn't want to see the department's reputation tarnished. One evening, as Darren sat on his porch, sipping his coffee and watching his daughters play in the yard, his phone buzzed with a text message. It was from a number he didn't recognize. "Watch your back, Washington." Darren stared at the message for a moment, his heart sinking. He had expected backlash, but this was different. This was a direct threat. He showed the text to Maya later that night, and they both agreed to report it to the FBI. Darren had dealt with threats before, but this felt more personal. He wasn't just fighting for justice anymore. He was fighting for his family's safety. The FBI took the threat seriously, launching an investigation to trace the source of the message. In the meantime, Darren and Maya took extra precautions, making sure their home security system was up to date and being more vigilant about their surroundings. Despite the growing tension, Darren refused to back down. He knew that the fight for justice wasn't going to be easy. It never was, but he was determined to see it through. A month had passed since the traffic stop, and the investigation into Officer Grant was nearing its conclusion. Darren had been called to testify before the police review board, alongside other individuals who had experienced similar harassment from Grant. The hearing was a pivotal moment, not just for Darren, but for the entire community. As Darren sat in the courthouse waiting to give his testimony, he felt a wave of emotions. This was it, the moment where everything would come to light. He had spent weeks preparing for this, gathering evidence, statements, and testimonies. But even with all the preparation, there was a part of him that couldn't shake the anxiety of what lay ahead. When Darren was finally called to the stand, he spoke with the calm, steady demeanor of a man who had seen and endured far more than anyone should. He recounted the events of that evening in meticulous detail, laying bare the racial bias and misconduct that had been at the heart of Grant's actions. The review board listened intently, And as Darren finished his testimony, he saw something in their faces that gave him hope, a sense of realization, perhaps even guilt. It was clear that they could no longer ignore what was happening in their city. The hearing continued for hours, with other victims sharing their stories of harassment and discrimination at the hands of Officer Grant. By the end of the day, the board had heard enough. A week after the hearing, the Police Review Board announced their decision. Officer Grant was officially fired from the force, and his misconduct was made public. It was a victory for Darren and the community, but it was also just the beginning. The news of Grant's firing sent shockwaves through the police department. Officers who had turned a blind eye to his behavior were forced to confront the reality that they had been complicit in a culture of silence. The police chief, under pressure from the public and local government, promised to implement reforms aimed at preventing racial profiling and ensuring accountability for officers who engaged in misconduct. For Darren, the victory was bittersweet. Justice had been served, but it had come at a cost. The threats, the media scrutiny, and the toll it had taken on his family were not things he could easily forget. In the days following Officer Grant's firing, the city of Tallahassee began to feel the effects of the decision. Darren's story was on the front page of the local paper, and it quickly spread to state and national news outlets. The headline read, "FBI agent's complaint leads to officer's dismissal after racial profiling incident." While the news brought hope to many, there were others who felt differently. The firing sparked heated debates in local forums, social media groups, and even on the streets. Some members of the police force defended Grant, claiming that he had just been doing his job and that the decision to fire him was a political move. Others, particularly those in the Black community, felt like this was a long overdue victory, a first step toward holding law enforcement accountable for their actions. As the debate raged on, Darren found himself receiving an outpouring of support from people he didn't even know. Letters arrived in his mailbox, and emails flooded his inbox. Many were from people who had experienced their own run-ins with racial profiling and harassment, but had never had the platform or opportunity to speak out. Darren had become an unintended symbol of hope for them, a sign that change, while slow, was possible. One evening, Darren sat on the couch with Maya, reading through the letters. One, in particular, caught his attention. It was from a young Black man named Jalen, who had been pulled over by Officer Grant a year earlier. "Mr. Washington," the letter began, "I've been following your story closely. I'm not an FBI agent or anyone with power, but I wanted to thank you for standing up to Officer Grant. Last year, he pulled me over when I was driving home from work. I wasn't speeding. I wasn't breaking any laws. But he treated me like I was guilty of something. He made me feel small and scared, and I never reported it because I thought no one would believe me. But seeing you take a stand has given me hope. You showed me that we don't have to stay silent. Thank you." Darren felt a lump rise in his throat as he read the words. Maya leaned over his shoulder and read along with him, her hand resting gently on his arm. "You did that," Maya said quietly, her voice filled with pride. "You showed people that they can fight back." Darren nodded, feeling the weight of it all settle on his chest. "I just hope this is the beginning of something bigger," he said softly. With Officer Grant's firing, the Tallahassee Police Department faced increasing pressure to address the larger issue of racial profiling within its ranks. The chief of police, who had initially been reluctant to take a strong stance on the matter, was now under public scrutiny. Community leaders organized town hall meetings, demanding transparency and accountability from the department. Darren, though not one to seek the spotlight, was asked to speak at one of these meetings. The town hall was held at the Leon County Civic Center, and by the time Darren arrived, the auditorium was packed. People of all ages and backgrounds filled the seats, eager to hear from local leaders and activists about how the city planned to move forward. Darren sat quietly in the back, listening as various speakers took the stage. There were parents who spoke about their children being targeted by the police, teachers who shared stories of students being harassed on their way to school, and community organizers who called for stronger oversight of law enforcement. The stories were all too familiar to Darren, and they weighed heavily on him. Finally, it was Darren's turn to speak. As he walked to the front of the room, the crowd fell silent. He wasn't used to this, speaking publicly about something so personal, but he knew that his words mattered now more than ever. "Good evening," Darren began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I didn't come here tonight because I wanted to be in the spotlight. I didn't ask for this. But what happened to me isn't just about one bad officer or one traffic stop. It's about a system that has allowed people like Officer Grant to act without consequences for far too long." Darren paused, scanning the room. The faces staring back at him were a mix of determination and empathy. "When I was pulled over that night," Darren continued, "I wasn't just another black man driving a nice car. I was an FBI agent, someone who knows the law and the rights we're all supposed to have. And yet none of that mattered to Officer Grant. To him, I was guilty the moment he saw me." The crowd remained silent, hanging on Darren's every word. "But this isn't just about me," Darren said, his voice growing stronger. "It's about all of us. It's about every person who has ever been made to feel less than, who has been judged based on the color of their skin instead of the content of their character. It's about making sure that what happened to me doesn't happen to anyone else." There were murmurs of agreement from the audience. "I'm not asking for sympathy," Darren said. "I'm asking for change. Real change. We need to hold our police officers to a higher standard. We need to demand accountability. And we need to make sure that no one is above the law." When Darren finished speaking, the room erupted into applause. He stepped down from the stage, feeling a sense of purpose that he hadn't felt in a long time. This fight was far from over, but for the first time, Darren felt like they were moving in the right direction. As the weeks turned into months, the impact of Darren's stand against Officer Grant continued to ripple through the community. The police department implemented new training programs focused on bias and de-escalation tactics. An independent oversight committee was established to review complaints against officers, and community outreach programs were created to build trust between law enforcement and the public. Darren, though no longer in the spotlight, continued to play a role in these efforts. He worked behind the scenes, meeting with city officials and community leaders to ensure that the changes being made were real and not just cosmetic. He knew that true reform would take time, but he was committed to seeing it through. One day, as Darren was leaving the FBI office after a long day of work, he received a call from Michael, his supervisor. "Darren," Michael said, "I just wanted to check in and see how you're doing." Darren smiled to himself. "I'm doing good, Michael. Thanks for asking." "I've been hearing great things about the work you've been doing in the community," Michael said. "You've made a real difference." Darren paused for a moment, letting the words sink in. "It's been a long road," he admitted, "but I think we're finally getting somewhere." Michael chuckled. "Well, if anyone could do it, it's you." As Darren hung up the phone, he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. It wasn't just about Officer Grant anymore. It was about creating a safer, more just world for his daughters and the generations that would follow. Months later, Darren's life had largely returned to normal. The media frenzy had died down, and Tallahassee was no longer the center of attention in the national conversation about police reform. But Darren's work was far from over. One evening, Darren was driving home from a late meeting when he saw a police cruiser parked on the side of the road. As he passed, he glanced at the officer in the car and felt a surge of recognition. It wasn't Officer Grant. He was long gone, but the sight of the uniform stirred something in Darren. Suddenly, the cruiser's lights flashed, and Darren's heart skipped a beat. But this time, instead of fear or frustration, Darren felt something else, a sense of calm. He knew who he was, and he knew that no matter what happened next, he would stand his ground. The officer approached Darren's car, and Darren rolled down the window, ready for whatever came next. But the officer's tone was different, respectful, almost apologetic. "Evening, sir," the officer said. "Sorry to bother you. I just wanted to let you know that your tail light is out." Darren nodded, thanking the officer for letting him know. As the officer returned to his car, Darren sat for a moment, reflecting on how much had changed in such a short time. The fear and tension that had once accompanied these interactions were gone. Darren started the engine and drove home, knowing that while the fight wasn't over, the world was a little better because he had taken a stand. Darren Washington's story wasn't just about one man's fight for justice. It was about a community that came together to demand accountability and fairness. It was about a system that had been broken for far too long and the people who refused to stay silent. As time passed, Darren's daughters grew up hearing stories about their father's bravery. They learned the importance of standing up for what was right, even when it was difficult. They learned that justice wasn't always easy to come by, but it was always worth fighting for. And so, Darren's legacy lived on, not just in the changes he helped bring to his community, but in the hearts and minds of everyone who had been inspired by his courage.